Welcome back. It is a pleasure to be with you again. During the last presentation, we discussed three basic ideas that developed within the early Christianity that were influenced by Greek philosophy. We talked about identity of Christ, and we discovered that Greek philosophy, as it was married to Christianity, created this kind of Christ who was not fully God but was subservient or so on. He was not fully God, and that led to Arian controversy, which was also a controversy about salvation too, not just about Jesus and who he was. So we talked about salvation, how diminishing of full divinity of Christ resulted in elevation of human works, and we're going to spend some more time about this during this presentation on this issue and during subsequent presentation when we discuss Roman Catholic Church understanding of salvation. And we also discovered that anti-Trinitarianism basically has its roots in Greek philosophy also. And then we talked about the church. The church, once again, the idea of the church as it developed borrowed some conceptions from Greek philosophy. And we noticed how this idea of eternal generation was embedded in the creeds of the church. So we'll continue today. We'll continue in the topic of salvation. And much of what I'm going to present in this lecture could seem at first irrelevant, but it is very important what happened during the controversy I'm going to talk about. It's very important for Adventism because we discuss those issues in a different way in 21st century in our churches. So when we understand that history, we can actually address some of the issues within Adventism more intelligently, including anti-Trinitarianism. But this will become more evident in later lectures. So today I would like to talk to you about Pelagian Controversy. It's a very important controversy in history of the church. First of all, we have Christological controversies, and now we have a Pelagian controversy. Pelagian controversy is all about salvation. It occurred during the 5th century between two Christian theologians, Pelagius and Augustine. So let me give you just a brief introduction, historical introduction to that. Pelagius was a British monk who came to Rome to teach. And he was horrified by moral laxity of the city. By that stage, Rome is Christian. Christianity is a religion of Roman Empire. But when, of course, Christianity became the religion of Roman Empire, the morals go down. And he was absolutely horrified by morality of the clergy and so on. And he began to teach against that. Of course, he already had developed theological ideas. Here, what I need to say to you is that we do not have many writings from Pelagius. Most of we know about him is from people who were writing against him and from his disciples. So Pelagianism that I'm going to describe to you today is a theological construct. And the other player in this controversy was Augustine. Augustine was a bishop of Hippo in North Africa, and he is considered to be most important thinker of early Christianity. The controversy was about salvation, as I already stated, but we today as Adventists tend to argue sometimes along similar lines. That's why we need to talk about this. So this discussion between those two theologians involve several important topics. What is the human nature? What is the nature of sin? What is the nature of God's grace? And what is the nature of salvation? And there are interrelationships between those ideas. As I stated in my previous presentation, up until Augustine, the idea of salvation did not get much attention. It was simply theosis, which is divinization. You just follow the example of Christ, become like him, God will see how good you are, and then he will decide your eternal allocation. And Augustine was kind of like that too. He believed in those ideas until he heard Pelagius, and everything changed for him, and he developed this teaching called Augustinianism today. So we're going to talk a little bit about those two thinkers today. So first of all, let me tell you about Pelagius. What did he teach? So human nature. He believed that people are born perfect, not touched by sin in any way, except the physical results of Adam's sin, like tiredness and so on, hunger and all kinds of issues. But as far as our moral nature, we are like Adam before he sinned. We are born perfect. We are not corrupted by sin in any way. We are born morally neutral. There's no direct connection morally between what Adam did and between his posteriority, between his children. So his children are not affected in any way. There's no such thing as sinful nature that Adam passed on to humanity. We are born just pure, perfect, morally perfect. We are born free with uncorrupted free will. And Pelagius places a very strong emphasis on free will. We are created free. Nothing can control human choices. God does not intervene with our choices. We are not impacted by God. We are not impacted by Satan in any way, because that's how God created humanity. And he also taught we are not born as sinners. So we are just born morally neutral. We are completely responsible by our sins. Listen to what he says. This is a quote from the letter to Demetrius, one of the remaining writings from Pelagius. Everything, good and evil, concerning which we are either worthy of praise or of blame, is done by us, not born with us. We are not born in our full development, but with a capacity for good and evil. We are begotten without virtue as much as without fault. And before the activity of the individual will, there's nothing in humans other than what God has placed in them. So you've got it right here. We are not born sinners, and God implanted virtue in us. We morally perfect. There's not a problem with us, and we've got perfect free will, and we do not become sinners until we get involved with sin. So we become sinners when we sin. So what is the nature of sin? And the basic definition of sin provided to us by Pelagius is refusal to perfectly obey God's commandments, specifically 10 commandments. Listen again to Pelagius from the same letter. Instead of regarding God's commands as a privilege, we cry out at God and say, this is too hard, this is too difficult, we cannot do it. We are only human and hindered by the weakness of the flesh. What blind madness, what blatant presumption. By doing this, we accuse the God of knowledge of a twofold ignorance of God's own creation and of God's own commands. So basically, he says that God gave commandments, we can obey the commandments. And there's no excuse for us to obey the commandments perfectly. So how do people become sinners if we are not born sinners? Okay, what is the nature of sin? How do we become sinners? We become sinners by example. So we are born perfect, but we see some children hitting other children, we see that they're doing something wrong, that they lie, and we kind of like, oh, okay, I want to do the same. And I choose wrong things, I choose disobey the commandments because I see other people to disobey them. I grew up in a home with parents who are sinners, who were not born sinners, but who became sinners, and they taught me, following the example, how to be sinners. So essentially it's a poor modeling. We are not born sinners. There's nothing wrong with our natures. What Adam did is not passed on to us, but we become sinners when we follow example of others. So what is the nature of God's grace? This is very interesting. Nature of God's grace, or God's grace, is giving us God's commandments. God did not have to give commandments to humanity when they sinned. He could just start over, but in his graciousness, he provided humanity with commandments. So they know how to do, they know what to do, they know what kind of guidelines to follow. So grace is God's revelation in commandments, that God gave commandments to humanity. They are available to all. Everyone has access to this. And Jesus did came to this earth to give us a perfect example of how to obey the commandments. So Pelagius believed that there can be a movement towards perfection if we look at Jesus, if we follow his example, then we are obligated to become like him. So listen again to what he says in Letters to Demetrius. God has not willed to command anything impossible. Our ambition should be directed towards holiness and moral perfection, towards becoming like Christ himself. So what is the nature of salvation in this whole thing? What do you think? What are the soteriological implications of Pelagianism? Basic implication of this is that salvation is purely by works. Okay, purely by, and I emphasize the word purely here. It's purely their works. If we are born morally perfect, we become sinners, God gives us guideline, we can get back to the perfection through the obedience to commandments. So this is purely by works. So Pelagius, this is in a nutshell what Pelagius was teaching. So he comes to Rome, he begins to teach this, then he goes in other places and he begins to teach this, and Augustine hears about it. And Augustine was awoken from his dogmatic slumbers, we could say, and he just gets angry. He becomes furious at what he is hearing, and he develops a theology that will go into the other extreme. So he believes that human nature was completely damaged. So what Adam did, it damaged him, and then everything that happened to Adam was passed on to all humanity. He was created as a perfect being, but he just got totally damaged. And he creates the idea that is known today as original sin. He's the father of this idea of original sin. Now, original sin is a complex theological issue. Every Christian, without exception, embraces some form of original sin. If you hear sometimes speakers saying we must reject original sin, it's all Augustinian, it shows the shallow theological and historical understanding of this idea. Biblically, it is impossible to reject the idea of original sin. So what is original sin? The basic definition is consequences of Adam and Eve's sin on them and the rest of humanity. Okay, so consequences of their sin on the rest of humanity. The problem is that there are different versions of original sin. Okay, this is the issue. If you believe that Adam and Eve's sin had some kind of consequences for humanity, you embrace the teaching of original sin. If you believe that Adam and Eve's sin had no consequences whatsoever on humanity, you reject the existence of original sin. So that Adam and Eve's sin did not impact anybody else, then you reject. But if you accept that there are some kind of consequences on Adam and Eve, then you embrace the idea of original sin. And this is why we must never say we need to reject the original sin idea. We must say we reject the particular idea, particular notion, particular definition of original sin. Because original sin is really a biblical doctrine that there are consequences for humanity. So we'll explore various understandings of original sin during the next presentations. So let me present to you the Augustinian understanding of original sin. First of all, he believed that the first, and this is, by the way, a simplistic kind of understanding. There's so much more into this. I'm trying to present it in a very simple way. First of all, the first element of Augustinian understanding was that we are guilty for Adam's sin. That basically means that Augustine believed that we were with Adam when he did the wrong thing, when he sinned. We were with him potentially as humanity. So we sinned with him, so we are guilty for his sin. In other words, all people sinned with Adam. That's the probably most controversial idea that we'll talk about it a little bit later on. The next idea is that we are totally corrupted, and we'll play with this total corruption later on in subsequent presentations. But totally depraved simply means that we have nothing in us that we can reach God. There's just no goodness in us left as far as the idea of salvation is concerned. And a third element in Augustinian understanding of original sin is that we have inclination to sin, that we are basically born with inclination to sin. So we've got three elements. Guilt of Adamic sin, we are born guilty, and this has powerful implications on the rest of Christianity, because all people are born guilty, that we are totally depraved, we'll work with this, and inclination to sin. So what are the consequences for humanity? We are dead meat. We are done deal. There's nothing in us that can please God. We're born guilty and condemned, because guilt condemns us, because we sinned with Adam. We're totally corrupted. We have inclination to sin, and it's passed on to all humanity, and there's just no hope for us. And he develops this idea that all humanity is born as massa damnata, the damned mass of humanity. We are all born damned before God and deserve total condemnation. So what is the nature of God's grace? And here things become interesting. The grace is unmerited favor of God. Now, this sounds very nice, but Augustine did not mean what you think he meant, just as we do right now. Basically, unmerited favor is that absolutely nothing to do with you. Absolutely nothing to do with you. God gives you grace, and that's it. You cannot respond, you cannot reject, and grace is, of course, irresistible. And therefore, for Augustine, salvation becomes unconditional. If we are totally depraved, if we are unable to choose God, He has to choose us, independent of our free will, which is depraved. So we don't really have this free will. We can't reject God's grace. We cannot say no to God. We are chosen without any conditions, like evidence of sanctification or something like that. There's absolutely no conditions. This is what it means, unmerited favor from God. So result is that God makes the choice. God chooses people whom He wants to save. So this is what Augustine meant, that salvation is purely by grace. Salvation is purely by grace. It's entirely God's work. I have absolutely nothing to do with this. There's no cooperation between me and God, because I can't cooperate. I'm totally depraved, right? So since I cannot choose God, God has to choose me. Salvation is purely by the grace of God. And of course, you know what another name for this teaching is. The name is predestination. Predestination. And here's the interesting thing. Augustine is the first thinker in Christian history to come up with the idea of predestination. And notice how it happened. There was this extreme view of Pelagius that salvation is just by works, and Augustine takes Christianity to completely different or opposite direction, another extreme, and he teaches that human works have absolutely nothing to do with salvation. And he's the first one to teach the doctrine of predestination. So in summary, we've got two opposing views of salvation. One is purely by works, the other one is purely by grace. In the next presentation, we'll explore this idea, how it works for both of those thinkers. Thank you.